Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Nicole Cole, and I'm a Senior Specialist of School Quality and Accountability with the DC Public Charter School Board. And DC PCSB has been hosting different series of webinars to support school leaders and teachers during school closures due to COVID-19. Today, I'm so excited to present today's session on staff wellness and appreciation. We have Alicia Robinson here along with Eric Callazo from WLA, Ashley Kearney, who is the 2020 DCPS Teacher of the Year, Dr. LaNail Plummer, as well as Lydia, Carlis. And I'm so excited for the panel today, the discussion all around staff wellness and appreciation. If you have anything that you'd like to share, you can feel free to utilize the chat. When you use the chat, please make sure to chat all panelists and all attendees so that everyone can see your responses. At the end of this session, I'll drop a very brief survey into the chat box. We really want to hear your feedback as we continue to develop this content to make sure it's meaningful and useful to you. I also will drop the link to the distance learning library. All of the webinars are recorded and all of the materials will be available for you there. You can also find materials and recordings from the past sessions that we've had. So hope everyone enjoys the session. As possible, feel free to utilize the chat and I will turn it over to Alicia.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you everyone for being here today. I'm excited to be with you during the session and excited about the panelists that we have today. As many of you know, this is the first of 4 sessions that we're doing this month at lunchtime at noon on Thursdays, talking about tackling various issues connected to talent as we go through this COVID-19 era. Some of you have already started to do this, but thanks for telling us who you are and where you're here with us from in the chat. So go ahead and feel free to say hi and tell us where you're coming from today in the chat. Today, our focus, of course, appropriately so during Educator Appreciation Week, is on staff wellness and appreciation. So we're going to be talking a lot today about staff wellness and things that people are doing like in the moment and right now as we think about taking care of ourselves as educators, particularly school-based educators, and thinking about how we're taking care of our staff in particular, but also we'll spend some time thinking about how we continue to do this. I keep saying to people that I think we started off this whole thing of going home and not being at school a couple months ago now, thinking it would just be a couple of weeks, but it certainly turned into a much longer experience, and we don't know exactly how long it will last, particularly in this distance format, and we need to be kind of preparing for the long haul. So with that, again, thank you, Nicole, for introducing me again. My name is Alicia Robinson. I work in DC and in other parts of the country, particularly at the intersection of talent and equity, and particularly helping schools and social sector organizations ensure that equity and inclusiveness are in their practices. And I want to introduce our great panelists here today to, first of all, as Nicole said a bit too, Ashley Kearney is a teacher who's with us today, and she is currently teaching at Ron Brown College Prep High School here in DC. It's part of DC Public Schools, but is I think she's most famously known as being the 2020 DC Public Schools Teacher of the Year. She also, as an educator, is very involved in community leadership activities, helping to co-launch things like a scholarship program for students of color and organizations that help to elevate the voices of students, families, and concerned community members in securing political wins that help shape policy for better education outcomes for all DC students. Eric is a principal, recently appointed principal at Washington Leadership Academy, though he's been with the team for a while there. He comes from the Bronx and we're lucky to have him here in DC, where he's been teaching and leading for many years, working first in DC through Teach for America at Kelly Miller Middle School, and then also being at Friendship Public Charter School and their network for a number of years. And as I said, is now the principal of Washington Leadership Academy, which serves students in 9th through 12th grade. And last but not least of our panelist list is Dr. LaNail Plummer, who is the owner and CEO of Onyx Therapy Group. She and her team of counselors, educational specialists, and interns operate 8 offices in DC, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. She has so many letters after her name, I can't even keep up with them all. She is quite credentialed and quite competent, and particularly after 13 years of clinical experience that spans variations in clients ages 3+, co-parenting couples, families, LGBTQ community, and so forth. She also has significant experience being a school-based staff member, doing work from the vantage point of schools and working still in schools. So again, excited to have our panelists with us today and hear from them in just a few minutes. But as people know, people who know me know, I like to make sure that we're always grounding things in equity. So I reached out to Lydia Carlis, who I'm going to introduce a little bit in just a second too, to help us do an activity to start off today as we think about this topic of staff wellness and appreciation, to help us think about how we ground this thinking in equity. So just as background, Dr. Lydia Carlis, who also has several letters behind her name, is a PhD DC-based educational researcher and photographer. Her education work focuses on ensuring educational equity for students most at risk when schools and systems fail them. And her photography connects what we do professionally with who we are as humans. She is very well known and has a lot of experience in both special education and educational research, but also being a school-based staff member herself, as she started her career in education as a classroom teacher too. So I will turn it over to Lydia to lead us in and explain a little bit more about the Equitizer. I'm sorry, and I neglected to move our slides ahead.
So thank you all for allowing me to start with a focus and lens on equity. Equitizers are ways that facilitate discussion, sometimes challenging and deep discussion early on in a session so that we can get to the work with some of our guards down. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to give you all 3 minutes to read this silently. It looks like some is missing from the question, but there's enough for you, hopefully, for you to get to the meat. So I'm going to be quiet for 3 minutes and allow folks to read. If you could, attendees, if you could put your thoughts in the chat, that would be great. I'm going to be reading them and potentially sharing those back out. And then our panelists are going to share out loud. Thank you. Okay, I am going to ask for our panelists to share your initial thoughts on the question. There are really two. What supports and resources should we be considering to ensure our staff are doing good and doing well? And then what might happen if we acknowledged the collective trauma our staff and families are experiencing and supported our staff with an array of strategies and resources. So anyone can start.
Okay, I can start. So again, I'm Ashley Kearney. First, I just need to acknowledge that that first paragraph just really resonated with me particularly. But if I had to say, like in my opinion, being a teacher who works in a ward and with students and communities who have higher poverty rates and who started out in much of the category that's recognized, I do think that the resources that we need most is training and consistent and frequent training from experts in the field and from representatives who understand the work that we're doing. In addition, this crisis that people are talking about, we've been experiencing it for some time. So some of the things that we've been doing inside of our schools and inside of our profession right now are the same things that I recommend, but just acknowledging it so that we can actually pause and respond to it. That said, if I had to say, in terms of like what should happen, or if we actually acknowledge it, then I think we'll be better prepared to respond to a situation like this if unfortunately we come across it again.
Thank you. So training would be something that could help everyone, and then just acknowledging and training from people who understand the students that you serve and the communities that you're working in. Thank you, Beer. LaNail?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to add in, again, thank you for having me here today. In addition to training, I think that there needs to be more access. There needs to be more mental health folks on staff or nearby to help out in these particular situations, and not just with what we're experiencing specifically around COVID-19, but the trauma overall. So COVID-19 is adding an additional level of trauma as we're processing the experiences that we're having individually, as well as our staff members and our children who are in situations of which we cannot control and cannot visibly see, right? We recognize that poverty has additional socioeconomic factors that influence the social emotional development, and that causes additional worry for us. But what I would like to happen, what I would like to see is that educators, staff members have more access to mental health providers. You know, oftentimes we hear that we're not around, that there's not enough, and indeed there's not a lot of therapists that have the cultural background that is needed to really relate. But those of us that are willing to do the extra work and go the extra mile, right? And so in terms of what do we need to be doing, I agree with Ashley that there needs to be training. I also think that there needs to be more focus and access to mental health providers, and we need to put our money where our mouth is. In terms of how we can address it through strategies, of course, creating space for people to talk. There's scientific research around what happens when we talk through our trauma, because our trauma gets kind of stuck in our limbic system, which is where a lot of our emotions and our amygdala is. And so being able to talk that through, having wellness opportunities and days, allowing for a culture around positivity and self-care. You know, in our schools, sometimes we get really caught up on the data and the science and the day-to-day work that we're not necessarily building in the culture of taking care of ourselves. We cross boundaries sometimes in those ways. So making sure we have lots of boundaries and things. I have tons of ideas, and so I don't want to take up all of that time because I know Eric has things to say too. But I have lots to say. But yes, I believe we can make this happen. We can make it happen.
Thank you. So just to recap, really focusing on access to mental health supports for staff and creating a culture of self-care. And you talked about making sure that there's space for folks to talk about how they're feeling and what they're experiencing. And Scott Goldstein in the comments said something very similar. So you all are on the same page really early, which is exciting to see. Go ahead, Eric.
All right, cool. I appreciate that. One of the things I think is really critical, especially in the role of a school leader, and the responsibilities that come along with it, is like we have to be very conscious that we're designing new frameworks, especially with this like remote learning and COVID-19 pandemic. And you have to design frameworks with the most marginalized in mind. Like you have to be able to be intentional about who the people you are serving, whether it is your staff or your students, and what they're going through. And in that process, you have to make sure that you're creating it not just for them, but with them. They need to be a voice that's active within that process of creating this new framework that we're in. So that's something that I've been very conscious about at this point, and we're constantly iterating and intentionally inputting their voices within this new framework that we're in.
Thank you, Eric. So thinking about for them, with them, for us, by us, that you are thinking about the most marginalized, but also thinking about that just because they are marginalized does not mean they don't have voice and they don't have power. So you're not empowering them, you are sharing and yielding some of your power to listen to their voices and make sure that what the solutions that you create are what they need and what they're going to use. So that's really great. I am going to turn it over, but I hope you all will read the comments because there are some great ideas in here, including creating an online resource library. Just some really great things that that we could be doing to support our staff. Thank you.
You got to unmute yourself.
For those of you who might be newer to Zoom, there's little dots down on the chat screen too that allow you to save the chat if you do want to save the things that you see there. And as Nicole said earlier, we'll also be sharing the recording. So things that, the ideas that we talk about today, you can go back and listen to or share with your teams too. Thank you so much, Dr. Lydia. Again, I think it's really important for us as we think about all of our work to really ground that in equity, and we think so much about grounding in the equity of our students and families. Today, we're going to spend more of our time kind of thinking about how we, I guess, essentially put our own oxygen masks on first, how we make sure that we're thinking about those needs of ourselves as educators, and particularly those of you who are working with students and families most closely day to day. And I think one of the things I think about in that is something that kind of came up in the chat, in this conversation and in the chat a bit too. Let's ask the educators, just ask the question of how are you doing? So want to start off our panel, official panel, first by just asking, first Ashley and Eric, as people working directly in schools with school-based staff, how are you doing? How is your life changing for you? What are the unique challenges you're dealing with in this new environment, and how are you doing with it?
So Eric, I went first last time, so feel free.
Appreciate that, thanks. I think overall good, as good as can be. That's typically how I respond when people say, how are you doing? I think that one of the things that's critical about this time is that, first of all, I definitely miss being in the building with kids, and definitely with the staff too. Like I thrive off of that human interaction, and that's something that's I definitely feel is lacking right now. So it's been a challenge just to feel like you're leading a group of folks and you're so distant from them. And I think just overall, one of the critical things that I've been really feeling is just the idea that this kind of video conferencing era that we're in, it is particularly draining, but just being very conscious about the fact that it can be draining, and setting aside time to do things that kind of fill the cup back up or fill that meter back up. Just taking personal time to do things that I enjoy, staying on top of health and fitness. And then also within work-related things, embedding time for me to just connect with people that's not just simply work. I have created open door sessions with my staff that we could just talk. And it just is a good way to connect, see how people are actually doing, hear what they're going through, whether it be something that's challenging or some fun stuff they're doing. People are taking on new hobbies, things like that. But that it still creates that human aspect of interaction. And that's been something that can help drive at least me to keep going and refill that cup as it starts to empty.
All right. So I think a lot of the work, since we are both in school, is a little bit similar. But I started off without a spring break, and at first it was kind of okay because mentally I had already prepared for April start of a spring break, right? So continuing to work was not a big deal. And even though they said spring break, it was an immediate turnaround to be able to dive into what we're calling remote or distance learning. So it was pretty difficult. But what I did do is lean on the relationships that I've had with students to kind of like make that process easier, not only for myself, but for peers who also share the same students who may not have had things set up in their classroom a certain way. So just trying to stretch myself a little bit further to help my peers and also lean on them for things that they were strong in. I think another thing that happened though was it's just been a lot of screen time. I'm used to moving. I can't sit down in my classroom for a long time. So it's just like overload. And that roller coaster in April just kind of hit a burnout. But I will say I also have to note that it's been a lot of time just checking myself. Like it feels like work. And that's a problem because work was not a good thing in many cases, if you understand like the systemic issues that exist. So trying to make this work right now is a difficult thing to kind of process while also trying to check your peers for certain things and allowing yourself to have your peers check you as well. So it's been a learning process, if I had to say the least.
Absolutely. And not to leave you out, Dr. Plummer, too, I know you're doing a lot of work right now working with educators and working even with families and students, too. So tell us, how are you doing? How are you taking care of yourself?
I'm doing okay. In the very beginning, the first 2 weeks of this pandemic, I was great, right? I was pushing through. I was very determined. I had a lot of perseverance. I also thought that this was going to be short term, so I was like, oh, I could just make it through. There's a huge cultural element to that, being a Black woman, right? Like an obstacle is placed in front of you, and you just keep pushing. By week 3 and week 4, I was like, oh, no, we can't keep doing this, right? Something has to change. And at that point, I started paying attention to my patterns, seeing when I was doing the best work, when I was the most tired, what was exhausting for me. I recognized by week 4 that Wednesdays were really tough days for me getting through that. And so subsequently being able to plan differently because Wednesdays were so challenging. To both Ashley and Eric's point, I experienced some of the same things in terms of videos being draining and body being more tired than normal, and why was I experiencing a little bit more headaches than normal. And of course, I did all the research around it to figure out what was happening with my brain and why I was so tired, why I was so sensitive to certain topics, and subsequently why my body was so tired. And it's because our brains are working so much harder. And there's a whole science behind that. And I know that's not the question you asked me, Alicia, so I'm not going to get into that. But I definitely realized that I had to pay attention to my peak times, and I had to pay attention to my low moments and low days, and I had to plan properly. I had to utilize my support system to have accountability groups around exercise and around self-care and around reading and hobbies and planning out my evenings with my children so that my cup could get full again. But I love the work that I'm doing, so this is a great time to be able to really focus on mental health. So that's always exciting for me. But I do recognize that in these past maybe 6 to 7 weeks, I have had some down days, of which made me a lot more relatable to the folks that I was working with in those moments. Because just because I'm a therapist doesn't mean that I have it all together and that it's perfect. So I appreciate the humanness, the shared humanness, the collectiveness of these experiences as well. So today I'm happy because I'm here with you.
Yay. And I love these conversations too. I mean, I'm not in the classroom directly anymore and working with students directly anymore, but I definitely feel what you're saying, Ashley, too, about missing. I think Eric said it too, also about just being missing that energy of being around students and kind of having that connection to why you're doing this, essentially. But I also really appreciate the thinking of like, how are we asking our own staff? How are we thinking about how they're doing? And that can change and so forth. So There are different organizations that have put out some different surveys and things. I've heard of some schools who have been doing these, whether they're informal, like in your kind of office hours that Eric talked about, asking people how they're doing, or actually sending out every couple of weeks a quick survey to staff with some really simple questions of how are you feeling right now and how are we doing at working with you. So thinking about checking on your own staff and being responsive to what staff needs. What are some of the things, Eric, that you guys are doing at WLA to be responsive? And, you know, again, thinking about how this has evolved in some ways. I think there were some things that made a lot of sense in the early days of this, and some things that have made more sense now, as like thinking about being on Zoom is, you know, a little bit overwhelming. You know, yet another Zoom event or something feels a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, so we've incorporated some things just to kind of keep, I guess you could say, the cup of our educators full. So we have some things that, like, for instance, I told you about the open door sessions. It's just like an open door. It doesn't have to be necessarily work related, but we talk and they get to connect with me. We do have regular check-ins with like vice principals checking in with teachers, just as like, you know, updates, any kind of support that's needed. So that's done on a weekly basis still. But also to keep some fun stuff too. We've done what we like consider like staff extracurriculars. So we've created like a virtual book club. They're currently reading Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. We also have a couple. There's a teacher that is doing like live workout sessions in the morning, so everybody could just zoom in and she creates the workouts and everybody follows along. Another workout one that's related is like we're doing like a workout challenge over the 30 days, so we've been doing that as well. But just like incorporating some fun stuff, and then also like you said with the survey, thankfully we were able to hold on to our regular week of spring break, so it was like just around like mid-April. So we had some time where we did our remote learning, we had our plan already in place, and then we were able to kind of have like a checkpoint in the middle, and we gave a survey out. We wanted to see, you know, what was working, how did teachers feel, they gave their input. We allowed them to kind of also like have a voice in this as well, like what could be changed when we return from spring break. And we did that. Like we heard their feedback. They said they wanted more. Like we gave a very, I would say, flexible schedule in the beginning where every teacher created one module, and that one module was like assigned on Monday, due by Thursday at midnight for kids. So it wasn't like a heavy load for teachers to create, but also not a heavy load for students to work with. And one of the things that we did here was that they would prefer live teaching sessions, or they thought it would be more helpful for students to attend, because kids had a hard time managing their time and knowing when they should check in for office hours, because that's what we were doing. We were doing like AM office hours, PM office hours. And kids, we know, teenagers, it's hard for them to manage their time. And a lot of them also don't know how to, like, you know, manage their time on top of like their sleep schedules are jacked up right now. So what we started to do was we incorporated live teaching based on the feedback from both staff, families, and students. And that's helped, because now they actually have a designated time. They know they're going to see XYZ students. The students know exactly when they're going to see that teacher for that subject. They have that support. And there's more structure, and that structure has actually helped provide like some consistency for people, and it's helped.
That's awesome. And I love the progression of how things have gone too. Just, you know, knowing that some of the things you might have tried out at the beginning might need some freshening up. and you might even, as the person administering in some ways, you might need some freshening up from it too, right?
Yeah, that spring break was great. That was like a nice little, like, just breather, then to come back into it with a new, like, revamped approach. And it was just good to just see like folks like having that sense of like, okay, we can have our input, and they see it reflected, and it gave them that time to adjust. Like, yeah, we had that flexible schedule in the beginning with open office hours, but as people got adjusted to this new life, this new COVID-19 pandemic, people started to say, okay, I can do more. I can be adjusted to this. So yeah. Totally.
How about you, Ashley? How's it looking at Ron Brown? How is the staff taking care of you? How are you helping to take care of your colleagues?
There's a lot going on at Ron Brown, but of course I love where I am for a lot of reasons, and similar to what you were saying, Eric, just the flexibility of it. We are very social staff, so like being around each other, hugging each other, playing with like that type of thing we miss, but we found time to do it in the virtual space. So we've had opportunities for our leaders to give us optional office hours to kind of attend and have like questions and things like that to respect people's schedules. We had situations where students, because of our special education population percentage, we definitely needed to do more live sessions and sort of cater to specific needs. So allowing us to have like focus group with teachers to say, hey, you also have kids, so what schedules kind of match with the students where we can also cut down on their screen time, and then allow for some social time for all staff to kind of, we do a lot of community circles. And it's a place where you can check in the news of the day, how families are doing, how we're doing in general. So moving that to, we do Instagram Live, and people kind of like joke and share the screens and all of that, to like private staff, kind of happy hours. But maybe, you have tea, but still, it's a time for you to kind of get together and enjoy one another's company. I think for me particularly, I make time for our class circles as a mindful minute in my classroom to kind of center the students. Make sure we have a good time. We make mistakes, we're vulnerable. They let us record them, which is cool. You always have to like just make sure we ask for permission, because sometimes in person we get so comfortable that online it can just be like a very interesting dynamic. But they like TikTok and staff like TikTok. So just making sure that we understand the human aspect of things, but not getting away from the importance of academics, but shifting it to fit the lifestyle and the unique passion and interest of the people that work in our space. The last thing I'll mention is that I just got some free lunch yesterday because we had a staff drive-by of just like picking up some lunch. So that was pretty cool. Even our principal was outside in the rain, just like giving us like sandwiches and stuff like that, like Pandora catering. So I can go on and on, but it's a good time to be at Ron Brown.
It sounds like it. And tell us, I think one of the things Lydia pointed out at the beginning too, and through the Equitizer, is just being able to connect to people who have lived experience that connects to the staff and to the students and so forth. And the one thing I forgot to mention in your bio is you're a DC native too. You went to DCPS. You went to. You're now teaching in DCPS, which I love. How does your unique lived experience help influence what things make sense to do for staff wellness?
Well, like I would go for staff and student, but just them understanding that like they might not be able to navigate certain parts of the city. They might like live far out in Maryland, but because I have family still here, like even my great grandmother, I had to go pick up Sunday dinner from her at a distance and like air hug her and stuff. So just like understanding, she has to read mouths. So us wearing masks and trying to talk and yelling across the way. But for students, it's understanding like, hey, I'll drop off some computers because I understand that the bus routes, even I rode the bus, even as an adult. So it's like, hey, instead of putting them on there, now I can drive, leave the computer out there, make sure everything is good. We have family and students dealing with grief. And I don't want to go into it too much, but just like understanding like, hey, we have to lean on each other. Some people are not comfortable with having certain conversations with families that I might have. So it's just a number of things. And also being here, I also have family who have students or kids in different schools, whether it be DCPS or charter. So just bringing those conversations to the table so that we understand what everyone is kind of dealing with, at least offering that perspective.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we won't even get into it, but if you know Ashley, you know that she's also taking care of her college students, her former students that are in college and such now too. So I know that goes broader than just the students you're reaching right now. And Dr. Plummer, there's so many things that, as you said earlier, there's so many tips I'm sure you can give us too, but there's so many things that go into thinking about this mental health side of things. The first piece I want to ask that's kind of, again, related to this lived experience piece is, as you said, you have kids at home too that are homeschooling while you're working from home and trying to help others out. So what tips, what ideas do you have? What have you been learning through this experience, through this pandemic, just, your work on both sides about how staff can really be, we can appreciate those staff that are also working with kids at home?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. My children are at DCI, and so I saw their athletic director on today also. So DCI and Basis, shout out to those two schools for educating my children. Some of the things that I've learned, or more so been reinforced with, is the idea of grace. We're not functioning the way that we traditionally function in schools or in our buildings, right? Our brains are not experiencing things in the more traditional ways. Our limbic system is activated, our amygdala is activated, the neuroscience behind our frontal cortex is being challenged in so many different ways. And it's difficult because we want to produce the way we normally produce. We want our children to continue to do the work. We want as leaders and staff members for our staff to be able to be productive, but that's really causing some issues in our brain, right? It's causing our brain to work a lot harder, and it's what's making us a lot more sluggish in different ways. And so giving myself a lot of grace, giving my children a lot of grace, more with my children, also thinking about the fact that although they are nearly 13 and 16 years old, they still don't have all of the communication skills and abilities that, say, someone who's 25 or 26 would have, right? Because they're still in adolescence until the age of 24. And so a lot of their expression still comes through their ability to play around, their ability to move their body, their ability to do games and things like that. And so while we're all experiencing these changes as adults, our kids are experiencing it in really interesting ways without the tools to really articulate what's happening for them. And so while I'm at home, I've been given a lot more flexibility and grace around the expectations that are placed upon them, really paying attention to their learning styles in different ways so that I can address not just their learning styles academically, but also their social and emotional development and learning as well, right? Because, for instance, my daughter likes to talk and articulate verbally, but my son would rather draw things out or act it out. And so being able to give both of them the space to kind of process what they're experiencing at these times, so that we're not just talking about some of these things. I create more boundaries for myself and more boundaries for my children too. You know, I'm traditionally that mom who will be sitting on the couch and ask for them to go get me a glass of water from the kitchen, right? And so now I have to create some boundaries around that too, because they're physically tired, even though they're not moving around as much. And that, again, has to do with their body. We're doing a lot more check-ins in our house, but with our friends and our family. I'm a veteran, so we call them battle buddies. But checking in with one or two people on a consistent basis, not everybody, because that could get exhausting too. In our home, we're also sharing jokes and memes, and with my staff too, because I have a team of about 30 with Onyx, and then I'm a faculty member at Hopkins. And so I do a lot of the same kind of aspects in terms of sharing jokes and sharing memes and being on GroupMe and even doing silly things like sharing coupons, right? Which throws people off because they think we're about to talk about work, and then I share a coupon about, I don't know, some store. So all kinds of different things. I make rest mandatory. So in our home, in my work with my students at Hopkins, in my work with Onyx, I really force people to take that time off, because otherwise they will just keep working, especially since there's no boundaries right now in terms of your workplace and your home place, because it's happening at the same place. And because your work device is also usually your leisure device, because it's your phone or your laptop. And so it's easy to go in and out of work and social time or relaxation time. So I put very strong boundaries around what work looks like and what rest looks like. And because we're experiencing trauma because of this pandemic, our cognition is not happening as frequently. And so there's grace around what actually has to be produced, which means I'm reducing the amount of hours that everybody is working, so that we can be mindful of the fact that our brain is trying to rest and adjust and evolve to this pandemic. And we have to be respectful of what our body is going through, even though our society is telling us to keep pushing forward.
And what would you tell, as a parent too, but a parent who also has a strong understanding of mental wellness and such too, as you've kind of had your children adjust to this situation, you know, both distance learning and just not being around their friends, not being in school and so forth. Have you had any experiences where you've had to push back a little bit on the school for things that they're offering? And are there suggestions you'd have for people like Eric and Ashley on, if they get that pushback from families, how they can manage their own wellness while also hearing what a parent might say?
Oh, you're trying to set me up, Alicia. You got me on here with all these educators asking me about my pushback. Now, you know I'm opinionated now, and I got many thoughts. I do believe.
I love it.
I believe in education 100% wholeheartedly, so much so that my life has been dedicated to that. Even again, as a faculty member at Hopkins, I know that our teachers are wonderful and strong and that they have resilience and can bounce back. I also did some research around the education processes that happened after Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. Our children will be okay if they miss out on a little bit of education over the next couple of weeks. They're not going to lose out on an entire grade. Our teachers and educators will get them back on track when August comes around, when September comes around. We see that they're able to do new things and different things. And so at this point, I think what needs to happen, especially because our brain is going through its own issues as it's experiencing trauma, is that we need to really be using this time to focus on emotional intelligence, not just the academic piece. We're putting a lot of pressure on the production of assignments, turning in assignments, learning particular things. And I'm not pushing back on the fact that students need to learn, but this is a prime time to learn emotional intelligence. This will be a beautiful time to do more social groups, more emotional groups with our students. Prime time to have them talk about what they're experiencing, to draw it out and write it out, to create poetry, to create art. And I'd love to see that my children are working on their schoolwork during the day, but I would love to see more time for them to be able to just talk to their teachers about life, right? And about their teachers' experiences and about what's happening with them. And I think that would also normalize the experience for our teachers too, because there's a lot of pressure on them to be producing a lot in these moments. And our brains, I keep talking about that our brains are just not in that place right now, which is why we're not producing as much as we would like to, because our limbic system is activated and our amygdala is activated. And if we could just have more social emotional time, because we understand the importance of emotional intelligence and how that really leads to success. We know academics lead to success. We know that intelligence leads to success, but even the most intelligent person without the social emotional development will not be able to accomplish certain things. And so my pushback on the systems right now is let us have more time for social emotional groups, social emotional development, relationship building with our teachers, not just the teachers they have this year, but maybe the teachers they're gonna have next year, maybe book club with them, or maybe art time with them, or things like that, that's not so focused on the production of academics, or the reflection of academics.
That's helpful. And I think, you know, in some ways I wonder if that, as educators, I think we often feel very compelled to make sure we're getting the lesson plans together and getting, you know, having enough instruction for students and keeping the, you know, the curriculum map moving along as it was planned for this school year. When you, Eric and Ashley, think about your own wellness and the wellness of your staff that you work with too, how does hearing that from both a parent and a mental health care practitioner contribute to your wellness? How does that kind of shift any thinking that you might be having, or give you almost permission in some ways to put wellness first?
It's been a long time coming, so I welcome them acknowledging it and saying it, you know, because I mentioned this, hopefully I mentioned it well in the beginning. I tried to articulate that a lot of the issues that we are experiencing, my peers specifically, in the schools that I've taught at least, have been dealing with learning loss over time. It's like this stagnant situation of like, it's almost summer all the time, because what were some students doing the summer before? So now we have what, 2 summers combined. The inequities in technology existed before. Inside of the school, I share a computer cart with between three classrooms, and we try to make it work. So we have flexed these muscles, and we've learned to make it normal. And I can flex these muscles now and use them, but when I don't have to, it's like, oh, thank you. Because I sure would like to cook, you know, thank you. Because I sure would like to learn how to download, you know, House Party and like have time with my niece on the phone, like those types of things. So it's really nice that they're acknowledging it. So hopefully they now look at some of those educators as experts to add to the conversation. So.
Sure.
Actually hearing from you, LaNail, I think it was pretty encouraging, because one of the things that I had to measure and like work with my leadership team on, and I'm grateful for them, was that we had to recognize that there's this balance of like academics versus like the personal well-being of our like students and staff. And one of the things that I had to kind of give a reality check to some staff is that, like you said, it's more important right now to make sure that our kids are well, that they're doing okay. And like, I actually worked with the team to just set goals, and priority goal number one was just make sure they're okay and make sure their well-being is priority. And then number two was academics. So, you know, I definitely got a lot of pushback with the whole like one module a week, like is that academically rigorous? Is that gonna set them back? But, you know, I had to just give a reality check to people. It's like, this is a pandemic. Like, people are going to be, and especially how it's dealing with like populations of African Americans and also Hispanics, like, and, you know, Latinos, it's affecting us more. And that's what my school is mostly comprised of. So I had to be aware of that, and we all have to be aware of that. And although there was pushback, I think now that we see what's going on and how serious it's been, that was initially how people reacted, but now that people are seeing how serious it is, people have like eased back with that pushback about academics. But yeah, I've had to have some serious and tough talks with teachers that like right now, you know, math and ELA can hold off for a little bit. We can still do things to maintain, but right now let's just make sure our kids and everyone else is okay. So that's encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome.
during these times, sorry, Alicia, during these times, the way what's happening with our brain is that innovation is not generally at the forefront right now, because our prefrontal cortex is not working in its maximum capacity. So innovation and learning at maximum is not likely to happen, but maintenance is, and maintaining around that social emotional piece as well, because that's the area of our brain that's triggered the most. And so when we think about emotional intelligence and regulation, to give voice to what people are experiencing is far more powerful than trying to push them to do something new and innovative, right? To be able to normalize an experience for someone and to give them the vocabulary so that they can later use that vocabulary to express themselves, to feel empowered, to feel encouraged, and to feel a sense of community is far more impactful than trying to learn specific lessons at this point in the middle of this pandemic. Again, this is a prime time to work on emotional intelligence, not just for children, but for those of us as adults and staff members as well, because we weren't always raised and trained around having emotional expression either, especially from cultural positions. That's not where we had a lot of voice. And so now is the time where we're experiencing something collectively, and it would be powerful to be able to talk about that collectively and to build community as such.
Oh, you just freed my whole soul. And I hope there's some educators on here who've been freed too. It's helpful to know the science essentially behind that. And, you know, I think there's a healthy chat going on in the chat too. And I wanted to kind of go back to this topic that came up in the teaser too about trauma-informed workplaces. And we have certainly heard a lot recently in the last few years about trauma-informed schools, and thinking very much about how our curriculum and the way we're teaching is trauma-informed. The term trauma-informed workplace has traditionally been used in reference to workplaces where like emergency personnel or people regularly dealing with clients facing traumatic events work. So I'm curious, Dr. Plummer, too, why might it be helpful as we think about fostering a culture of wellness to think of schools as trauma-informed workplaces, particularly as I know you mentioned thinking about life post-Katrina and things like that. Like, I'm curious about that. And also I'm curious if you can walk us through some ways that schools can create trauma-informed workplaces for their staff as a way to foster wellness.
Absolutely. I think all places of work could potentially have trauma-informed practices, but schools particularly, because children that are experiencing trauma generally are more comfortable bringing that forward at school than they are at home, especially if the home place is where they're experiencing the trauma. So the very first time they start talking about or expressing their trauma is usually somewhere in the classroom. And like I said before, most children don't have the vocabulary to be able to articulate what's happening. So instead they act it out. And we're the first ones as educators to see that. And we're, you know, the more time we spend in education, the more keen our eye becomes. And we can tell very quickly when something is off, even from a day-to-day experience. And so in knowing that children and parents and adults, staff members who are experiencing trauma, they generally bring it to the place that they are most comfortable and most safe. We act out in the safest places, not in the places where we have the most fear. So they're acting out at home, at school, because that's where they feel the safest, right? And so we need to be aware of all the different ways that trauma can show up for people. So it's important to, because we are the welcoming body to some degree for that trauma, we need to be able to understand it and then to be able to provide specific care around it. That's first with primary trauma. Then there's secondary trauma, because many people who go into education are going into education to be educators. They're not going into education to be healers of trauma or even receivers of trauma. They don't even understand all the aspects of the trauma as it relates to the brain, as it relates to cognition, as it relates to the body, and the subsequent impact on body, like chemicals such as dopamine, serotonin levels, cortisol, and things like that, right? And so they themselves start to experience secondary trauma, which causes more issues, because we understand that when trauma has occurred, the cognition levels are lowered. And that also means that staff members' cognition levels have lowered if they've experienced secondary trauma. So when school leaders are asking staff members who have experienced secondary trauma to have innovative ideas and they're not producing, we need to recognize that maybe that person has experienced their own trauma and subsequently cannot produce the way that we would want them to, because we have not addressed the secondary trauma that they have experienced. So for me, my position is consistently around increasing socio-emotional curriculum and learning and lessons so that people can talk. One of the major ways of addressing trauma, because it happens in our limbic system, is to try to move it forward through some of those neural pathways through our frontal cortex. That happens through talking it out or acting it out or writing it out, anything that moves us from the emotion to the cognition, which means we need to use more communication-based processes, communication steps, problem-solving processes that are steps so that there's structure and predictability in how to address certain things. We absolutely need to have more counselors on staff. We have school counselors who are trained in school-based work, but we also need community-based and clinical counselors who are there also, because again, teaching at the graduate level, what our school counselors learn is not always the same as what our clinical staff learn. And so our school counselors are great, absolutely amazing, but it would be great to have some trauma-based clinicians that are there as well to address some of this. And then being able to have wellness days where we take time apart and we just talk about the things that are going on and not always, again, being so focused on the academic piece. Again, academics are highly important, but so is the social emotional. And we often put our social emotional on the back end and are wondering why our children aren't learning the way that they need to academically, and it's because they've experienced some sort of trauma. Also why some of our teachers aren't learning the way that they need to, or why they can't produce the way that they need to. So I think making that social emotional piece along with the academic piece equal is what we need to be doing right now, not one above the other. And again, I know that that could be controversial, especially in this particular setting, but I believe based off of my experiences specifically at DC Bilingual, when we were doing that, we definitely saw a change in what was happening with our students, and it was extremely positive at the time as well. So there's many things that we can do, many tips, and I see on the panel or on the chat there's lots of ideas and questions. And so Alicia, I don't have a problem putting together a simple document that can be given out to the staff so that they can use to at least springboard and kickstart some of this work that I'm talking about today.
Yeah, that would be great. And I think Monique Leopold also mentions this idea of thinking about vicarious trauma and how we, this is not just a situation where, not that this is small, but where a student has experienced some trauma in their own lives and then the teacher is dealing with secondary trauma. The teacher and the school leaders are also dealing with being in this trauma themselves. So I'm, not a mental health practitioner like yourself, but did a little research myself on like, what's it like for teachers after 9/11 and, things like that like when you have experience, you're dealing with grief and all of that too. So I think that's something for us all to be continuing to look at as we think about this culture of wellness. We, Nicole has put in the chat box a survey as we're running low on time. There's another PCSB webinar that's about to start in a few minutes too. We're running low on time, so make sure you fill out the survey. There'll also be, we'll send out this recording. There's also a place on the PCSB website where there are resources, so we can take resources from these different webinars. So we can take some of the pieces that you just mentioned, Dr. Plummer, and put them on the webinar, on the website too. Just want to also point out too, I've thought too about some of the ways that schools can help their teams, and have a blog piece that kind of talks about listening, practicing flexibility and inclusivity, kind of lifting the communications veil, ensuring basic needs are met, demonstrating appreciation, and providing tools and resources as we continue to think about wellness from a long-term perspective. You can see that on my blog at EdPlus Consulting. And thanks for the questions that you all threw out in the chat too. Those were really helpful to kind of keep the conversation going, as well as the suggestions that you threw out. And again, want to remind you that we'll have another Talent Thursday session next week talking about what the PD and onboarding this summer should look like as we get ready to reopen school. It's a big topic that people are thinking about. And just lastly, of course, want to thank all of our panelists, including Dr. Lydia Carlis, who has helped in answering some questions too in the chat throughout the session. But I'm sure all of our panelists would be happy for you to reach out to them with any thoughts or comments or questions for them too. Thank you guys so much for being with us today. And again, before we close the chat, do go ahead and save it if you'd like to. There's those 3 dots on the website where the chat is, say save chat. So you can do that real quickly now to save all these great ideas. And thank you again, Eric, Ashley, and Dr. Plummer for being with us today. And all of you panelists, all that are here today, and also those that will listen separately. You know, as I keep saying to people, stay well, stay home, but really do think about putting on your own oxygen masks first as you're taking care of all the other people in your lives.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Bye all.